The moment everything collapsed. That spectacular unraveling arrived on a Tuesday morning in the Johnson Conference Center, when my body finally delivered the message my mind refused to receive. I was midway through slide 15 of my meticulously prepared presentation when reality began to fracture. The boardroom suddenly seemed both impossibly vast and suffocatingly small. 12 executives from our parent company sat watching me, their faces transforming from polite interest to confused concern as my carefully orchestrated performance began to disintegrate. The morning had started with such promise. I'd arrived 90 minutes early to test the projection system, arrange my handouts at precise 45-degree angles, and review my talking points one final time. The quarterly strategy proposal represented 6 weeks of preparation, research, and rehearsal. I knew every number, anticipated every potential objection, and had crafted responses to questions that hadn't even been formulated yet. When I stepped to the front of the room at precisely 9 a.m., I exuded the familiar aura of unshakable competence that had become my professional calling card. The market analysis suggests an untapped opportunity in the Southeast region, I explained, gesturing to a complex data visualization. The words flowed effortlessly, my voice steady and authoritative. 414 perfect slides. I was the embodiment of professional mastery, poised, articulate, completely in command. Then came slide 15. The first warning sign was a peculiar tightness in my chest, like someone slowly inflating a balloon beneath my sternum. I dismissed it, pressing forward with my rehearsed points about projected ROI. Then came an odd tingling sensation spreading through my fingertips, as if they were simultaneously falling asleep and becoming hypersensitive. I tightened my grip on the presentation remote, hoping no one had noticed the slight tremor in my right hand. As you can see from these projections, my voice caught unexpectedly, a microsecond of silence that felt like an eternity. I cleared my throat and continued, but something fundamental had shifted. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force, I became certain everyone could see my silk blouse pulsating. Heat crawled up my neck and bloomed across my face. The CFO asked a question about Year 3 projections. I opened my mouth to deliver the perfectly prepared response, but the words dissolved before reaching my tongue. My brain operated in a different time signature than my body, thoughts racing at impossible speed, while my physical responses slowed to a glacial pace. The silence stretched uncomfortably as 12 pairs of eyes fixed on me, waiting. The single syllable emerged strangled and unfamiliar. The moment of no return had arrived, like a row of dominoes beginning their inevitable cascade. The room began to undulate, solid corporate architecture becoming suddenly fluid. My vision constricted, the periphery darkening like an old photograph burning from the edges inward. The faces before me blurred and doubled. There was a moment of perfect, terrible clarity in which I understood what was happening, but remained powerless to stop it. After years of maintaining absolute control, I was watching myself unravel in real time, before the very people whose approval I had spent a decade cultivating. The recognition only accelerated the spiral. My breathing transformed into shallow, desperate gasps as an invisible vice tightened around my chest. The primal certainty of impending doom flooded my system. Not abstract worry of professional embarrassment, but the bone-deep conviction that I was dying. My knees weakened, forcing me to grip the podium to remain upright. "Are you all right?" The CEO's voice seemed to reach me from underwater, distorted and distant. I tried to respond, to salvage some fragment of my disintegrating facade, but my mouth had gone desert dry. The words, "I'm fine," formed in my mind, but emerged as an unintelligible croak. The most bizarre aspect was the sensation of simultaneous absence and presence. I was both trapped inside the excruciating experience and somehow hovering above it, watching with detached horror as years of carefully constructed identity collapsed like a house of cards. Part of me observed with clinical precision as my professional persona crumbled, while another part remained locked inside the experience, consumed by terror. "Perhaps we should take a break," someone suggested, their voice barely penetrating the roaring in my ears. I managed a jerky nod, though the simple movement sent the room spinning violently. The HR director approached, touching my elbow gently. The physical contact acted like an electrical shock, intensifying rather than calming my system's revolt. I fumbled with my papers, the meticulously organized handouts scattering across the polished conference table as my water glass tipped, liquid spreading across my perfect presentation materials. The harder I fought to regain control, the more spectacularly I lost it. Each desperate attempt to appear composed only heightened my awareness of how thoroughly I was failing. I tried taking a deep breath, but my lungs seemed to have forgotten their basic function, triggering a coughing fit that further demolished any remnants of professional composure. What nobody in that room could possibly understand was that they weren't simply watching a colleague have a panic attack during a presentation. They were witnessing the violent collapse of an identity constructed over years. The shattering of a persona I had cultivated so carefully that even I had forgotten it wasn't real. This breakdown wasn't professional embarrassment. It was existential annihilation. Someone guided me to a chair, while another pressed a cold water bottle into my trembling hands. Through the fog of panic, I became aware of concerned murmurs, people leaving the room to give me space, and the humiliating knowledge that this moment would become corporate legend. My professional reputation dissolved as rapidly as my capacity to form coherent sentences. "Just breathe," someone advised, as if I had simply forgotten how. But that was precisely the problem. My body had staged a revolution against years of neglect, choosing the most devastating possible moment to reclaim its authority. As the physical symptoms began to subside, the room stopping its nauseating spin, my breathing settling into something less desperate, crushing shame emerged. The vulnerability I had spent a lifetime concealing had been brutally exposed. I sat slumped in the executive conference room, sweat-soaked and trembling, the emperor finally exposed without his clothes. The meeting was adjourned. Someone called a car service to take me home. I remember the excruciating walk through the office, passing colleagues whose expressions ranged from awkward sympathy to barely concealed curiosity. What I couldn't recognize in that moment of absolute humiliation was that this catastrophic breakdown contained the seeds of my most profound breakthrough. The panic attack that seemed like professional suicide was actually the first honest moment I'd experienced in years. My body, after sending increasingly urgent messages I systematically ignored, had finally resorted to the corporate equivalent of setting off a fire alarm during the board meeting. This was years of denied emotions, suppressed needs, and ignored truths, staging a dramatic prison break from my carefully constructed persona. My authentic self, long banished to the shadows, had finally broken through the increasingly brittle shell of my professional identity. The aftermath of shattered identity. While my colleagues witnessed what looked like a simple panic attack, what they couldn't see was the complete dissolution of the person I thought I was. The prison break of my authentic self didn't lead to immediate freedom. Instead, it threw me into a darkness so profound I couldn't even remember what light looked like. What happens when the mask you've worn becomes inseparable from your face, and then suddenly cracks beyond repair? I left that boardroom with shaking legs, refusing eye contact with anyone I passed. The concerned hand of my department, head on my shoulder, felt like it was burning through my jacket. "Take the rest of the week," she said, but her eyes revealed what she was really thinking, that I was damaged goods, a liability. In the elevator down, I stood in the corner, staring at the floor numbers, praying no one would join me. The building I had once strutted through with confidence now felt like a gauntlet I needed to escape. The drive home exists in my memory as fragments. Gripping the steering, while so tightly my knuckles turned white, pulling over twice when tears blurred my vision. The strange sensation of being both inside and outside my body simultaneously. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages I couldn't bear to read. For 3 days, I didn't leave my apartment. The blinds remained drawn, creating a timeless cave where I could hide from the world I no longer knew how to navigate. I moved between my bed and couch in a daze, replaying the boardroom scene on endless loop. Food lost its taste. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by dreams where I was standing naked in front of laughing executives. When I finally answered my phone, it was my best friend of 15 years, threatening to call emergency services if I didn't respond. "I just need space," I told her, but she insisted on coming over. When she arrived, her expression shifted from concern to shock. I hadn't showered in days. The person in my bathroom mirror was a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, haunted. "Everyone has bad days," she offered while making tea I didn't want. "Remember when Sarah froze during her dissertation defense?" She bounced back, but her comparison highlighted how profoundly she misunderstood. This was an existential collapse. I nodded anyway, feeling a new chasm opening between us. How could I explain that the competent, ambitious friend she knew had never actually existed? The following Monday, I requested a leave of absence, crafting an email that took 4 hours to write. Each word carefully chosen to suggest a temporary medical issue rather than a complete psychological breakdown. My boss responded with corporate compassion. Reading between the lines, I wondered if they were already planning for my permanent replacement. Without my professional role as anchor, I had no idea who I was supposed to be. My morning routine, once a precision-timed sequence, dissolved into aimless hours. The planner that had governed my life sat untouched on my desk. I was like a complex machine with its central gear removed, all the remaining parts still intact, but unable to function, spinning uselessly without purpose or direction. Social invitations dwindled as I declined one after another. Even family calls became exercises in performance I could no longer sustain. The gap between my internal reality and the words coming out of my mouth grew so wide I sometimes lost track of what I was saying mid-sentence. One afternoon, while sorting through old work files, I found a congratulatory card my team had given me after a successful product launch. "We couldn't have done it without your leadership," someone had written. I traced the words with my finger, trying to reconnect with the person who had received this praise. The card fell from my hands as I realized I couldn't remember what that accomplishment had actually meant to me beyond another line on my resume. Another performance that earned external validation. Relationships I'd valued were built on the foundation of who they thought I was. Friends grew uncomfortable with my inability to maintain cheerful optimism. "You're just not yourself lately," they'd say, not realizing how accidentally profound that observation was. I wasn't myself, because that self had been a carefully constructed fiction. I began avoiding mirrors, startled by the unfamiliar person looking back. Without the armor of perfect appearance and professional confidence, who was this vulnerable creature with uncertain eyes? The simplest interactions became minefields of potential exposure. Financial reality eventually forced a reckoning. Sitting in a coffee shop across from a previous mentor, I found myself unable to summon the confident persona that had once been so automatic. My voice faltered. His slightly confused expression told me everything. The person he wanted to hire no longer existed. Depression settled over me, distorting my perception. Past accomplishments now seemed hollow. The emptiness beneath my carefully constructed facade was terrifying, a void where a core self should have been. The lowest point came 3 months after the boardroom incident. Staring at my reflection one morning, I didn't recognize the person looking back. "Who are you?" I whispered to the mirror, and for the first time, I had no answer at all. The complete absence of identity brought me to my knees on the bathroom floor. Yet something unexpected happened in that moment of complete surrender. As I knelt there, face in hands, I felt a strange sense of space opening up inside me. With nothing left to lose, no image left to protect, I found myself asking new questions. Not, how do I fix this? But, what if this collapse is actually necessary? What if the very structure that had provided safety and success was also preventing something more authentic from emerging? In that raw state of emptiness, long-buried questions about meaning and purpose began to surface. What truly mattered to me beyond external validation? What values would I choose if building from scratch? The questions carried a strange energy, the first stirrings of curiosity after months of despair. I began filling journals not with plans and goals as before, but with messy explorations of these fundamental questions I'd never allowed myself to ask. Looking back now, I recognize that hitting absolute bottom created the necessary conditions for transformation. The complete dismantling of my external identity, painful as it was, created space that would never have existed otherwise. Like a forest after wildfire, the scorched landscape of my former self became fertile ground where something new could eventually take root. Not a carefully constructed image this time. The fertile ground that emerged organically from my actual didn't nurture beautiful flowers first. It surfaced the weeds I'd spent decades burying. Behind the perfect professional image I'd crafted was a graveyard of denied emotions and rejected parts of myself. And now, without my protective mask, these ghosts were rising to demand recognition. What happens when everything you've desperately tried not to be suddenly demands to be acknowledged? In the quiet aftermath of my breakdown, something unexpected began stirring in the emptiness. The emergence of what psychologists call the shadow self. This practical reality we all face comprises those parts of ourselves we've decided aren't acceptable. The emotions and traits we've banished from our conscious awareness because they don't fit our idealized self-image. For me, these shadows were anything that contradicted my carefully constructed professional persona. Vulnerability, uncertainty, anger, neediness, all tucked away in the darkest corners of my psyche. like creatures that only emerge in total darkness. The first shadow aspect that surfaced was raw vulnerability. Having built my entire identity around projecting strength and certainty, I now found myself overwhelmed by waves of helplessness that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. I'd wake in the middle of the night, my body shaking with primal fear, the type that strips you of any illusion of control. It would surge through my body until I could barely breathe, leaving me curled up on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself since childhood. What made this experience particularly disorienting was that vulnerability wasn't new to me. I'd simply become proficient at transforming it into productive action. Now, with my coping mechanisms dismantled, I was experiencing emotional states directly, without the buffer of my professional identity to transmute them into something useful. From this exposed vulnerability emerged rage, a volcanic anger that shocked me with its intensity. I found myself furiously scribbling in journals about all the times I'd swallowed my true reactions to preserve relationships or advance professionally. The anger targeted both others and myself. For maintaining the charade for so long, for allowing my authentic responses to be buried under layers of strategic self-presentation. Have you ever wondered what emotions you've pushed down to survive in your professional world? The most unsettling aspect of facing my shadow wasn't these emotions themselves, but their connection to childhood memories that began surfacing with unexpected clarity. One particular memory kept repeating in my dreams. I was 7 years old, sitting at the dinner table while my father criticized my mother's cooking. I'd watched her face fall, noted how she shrunk into herself, and made an unconscious decision in that moment. I would never allow myself to be that vulnerable to another person's opinion. I would become unassailable through achievement and self-control. Another pivotal memory, standing backstage before an elementary school play, sick with anxiety, but forcing a smile when my teacher asked if I was ready. "I'm fine," I'd said, swallowing my fear. The teacher had patted my shoulder, saying, "You're always so prepared, so composed," and I'd felt the first intoxicating rush of approval that comes from successful masking. Even then, I was learning to trade authenticity for validation, a pattern that would eventually construct the prison of my professional identity. These weren't random recollections, but formative moments when I'd started compartmentalizing myself, deciding which aspects were acceptable for public consumption and which needed hiding. Now, these memories served as archaeological evidence of how my fragmented self had been constructed over decades. My dreams became increasingly vivid during this period, as though my subconscious was seizing the opportunity presented by my shattered defenses. In one recurring dream, I'd be standing in front of a mirror that suddenly cracked, revealing not my reflection, but a child's face. My face, looking out with profound disappointment. My mind was clearly trying to reconnect me with discarded aspects of myself. What became increasingly clear through this painful excavation was that fear had been the primary architect of my former self. Fear of failure, judgment, rejection. I'd been so terrified of being found inadequate that I'd constructed an impenetrable facade that even I had come to believe was the real me. The irony, in trying to create an identity that could never be rejected, I'd rejected the most authentic parts of myself. The full weight of this realization hit me one morning as I stood in my kitchen, staring at the wall calendar still open to the month of my breakdown, though 3 months had now passed. I'd been frozen in time, clinging to the remnants of a life that no longer existed, afraid to acknowledge that the person who had meticulously maintained that calendar was gone. In that moment, I felt crushing grief for all I'd sacrificed to maintain my perfect image. Birthday celebrations cut short to prepare for presentations. Genuine emotional responses swallowed and replaced with strategic ones. Relationships kept at a careful distance. I'd been so focused on avoiding failure that I'd failed at the most fundamental human task, being fully alive. Perhaps the most difficult aspect to accept was how this pattern had affected my relationships. Friends had known only the curated version of me. Family members had grown accustomed to brief, upbeat updates that revealed nothing of substance. Romantic partners had eventually drifted away, frustrated by their inability to connect with the person behind the polished exterior. The shadow aspects I was now confronting weren't simply negative traits I'd hidden away. They were essential parts of my humanity that I'd denied expression. My vulnerability contained the capacity for genuine connection. My anger held important boundaries I'd failed to establish. My fear, if acknowledged rather than suppressed, might have guided me toward authentic choices rather than driving me to build higher walls.